All right, we're looking at Acts chapters 10 and 11. The first question says, in the entire story, that's of Cornelius in chapter 10, list everything that God, through the Spirit, explicitly said to Peter. And you would think this would be a long list. Peter, after all, is the most prominent disciple of Jesus. He's been with Jesus from the beginning, and we see many things that Jesus says to him very specifically. And, you know, he has a great relationship with God. You see, of course, him preaching at Pentecost. You see him being filled with the Spirit, preaching very boldly to the Sadducees and the Pharisees and the other religious leaders. So you would kind of expect, this is the way I would think of it, and I think most of us think that, you know, Peter has this close relationship with the Lord, and that he's talking to him and guiding him and speaking to him throughout most of his life. And all of his actions are guided by the Spirit through a voice, through maybe the still small voice, but God's speaking to him and guiding him. In this very significant story, there are actually only two instances where Jesus speaks directly, explicitly to Peter. The first is in the vision, and that probably shouldn't count, but here in the vision, in chapter 10 of Acts, verse 13, remember he sees the vision in verse 12 of all kinds of four-footed animals and reptiles of the earth and birds of the air in this sheet that's coming down, being knit together at the four corners. The voice tells him in verse 13, "Get up, Peter, kill and eat." He says no, because he's never eaten anything impure or unclean. Verse 15, the voice responds again, saying, "Do not call anything impure that God has made clean." So there's one explicit revelation from God. Very confusing to Peter and confusing to us if you just look at it. It's quite strange. The next explicit reference that we have from God is in verse 19. While Peter was still thinking about the vision, the Spirit said to him, "Simon, 3 men are looking for you, so get up and go downstairs. Do not hesitate to go with them, for I have sent them." So he's just told that he needs to go with these 3 men without doubting anything, because God had sent them. And that's it. That's all we have explicitly coming from the Lord to Peter in this story. Number 2 asks, how did Peter discover the interpretation of his vision? Now, again, we already looked at all of the explicit statements from God, so we know that there was no explicit statement from God or from Jesus explaining the vision to him. So how did he come to the conclusion of the interpretation of this vision? This is here in verse 28. And he said to them, this is Peter speaking, "You are all well aware that it is against our law for a Jew to associate with a Gentile or visit him. But God has shown me that I should not call any man impure or unclean. So when I was sent for, I came without raising any objection. May I ask why you sent for me?" Something very subtle but significant in Peter's statement here. He says, God has shown me that I should not call any, and here's the important word, any man, any human, any person impure or unclean. You remember the vision that Peter saw. The sheet was full of animals, full of reptiles of the land, birds of the air. That's again from verse 12, four-footed animals, unclean animals. No people were in the sheet, and he was told to kill and eat those animals, but he says no, he wouldn't eat anything impure. He never eaten anything impure or unclean. And then he says the response is that what God has cleansed, don't you call unclean or impure. But Peter says that he has been shown that he should not call any man. So the jump here is from the animals in the vision to humans. How is it that Peter concludes that the vision was talking about humans? Again, we already looked at the explicit statements from God. It was not because God told him this explicitly. It was because Peter, and there's 2 phrases here. In verse 17, it says, while Peter was wondering about the meaning of the vision. That means he himself, he's thinking about, he's wondering, I wonder what this vision means. Then something happens, and then verse 19 here, While Peter was still thinking about the vision, the Spirit said, I'm going to emphasize it just as I've done in the other chapters here. He was thinking. He was exercising his mind, exercising reason, exercising his understanding, what he knew about God, what he knew about the scriptures, what he had experienced with Jesus. He's trying to mesh that with what he saw in this vision, and he's trying to discern what this vision means by that means. He's trying to understand what is it that God is trying to communicate to him through this vision. And he feels confident here, according to verse 28 that we were in, that he figured it out. Again, no assurance from God explicitly, but he is confident that God has shown me that I should not call any man impure or unclean. I want to emphasize something here, that Jesus promises in John 16, I think verse 13, he says that the Spirit of truth will guide you into all truth. He doesn't say the Spirit of truth will tell you all truth. That's never been a promise of God. We have, again, James, where we're told if anyone lacks wisdom, let him ask. And God gives wisdom to help us understand. There's a very, very beautiful promise in Proverbs. It's one of my favorite passages. Proverbs chapter 2, and starting in verse 4, it says, verse 3, if you call out for insight and cry aloud for understanding. So insight, understanding. And if you look for it as for silver and search for it as for hidden treasure, then you will understand the fear of the Lord and find the knowledge of God. For the Lord gives wisdom, and from his mouth comes knowledge and understanding. These are the things that we are to seek from God, and these are the things that God gives. Again, in Acts chapter 10, God did not give the answer, did not give the explicit revelation of what he was trying to communicate to Peter. That was really what Acts 10 is all about. He's trying to communicate to Peter that the Gentiles are not unclean because he would purify their hearts by faith. He would accept them based on their faith. But instead of just telling Peter that, which would have been very simple, very easy, at the same time, instead of having this vision thing, instead of having this people seeking him and him having to go with these people, instead of having Peter have all that time of not knowing, not understanding, God could have just said from the beginning, Peter, the Gentiles that have accepted me will be accepted without being circumcised. We could have had just 2 verses in the entire chapter. But rather, in harmony with what Jesus promised, in harmony with what Proverbs says, in harmony with what James says, God guided him into all truth. He gave him experiences that would teach him what the lesson was, that would show him, as Peter says, God has shown me in verse 28. He has shown me that I should not call any man impure. Another point to make from this is that Peter knew that this was the way that God revealed himself to him. He has this strange vision. Instead of waiting or asking even for God to just interpret it for him, instead of saying, okay, Lord, I had this strange vision. What does it mean? Tell me what it means. It says again, I read it before in verse 17 and verse 19. Verse 17, he says, Peter was wondering about the meaning of the vision. He himself was wondering. Verse 19 says it this way, he was still thinking about the vision. There's 2 applications I want to make of this because I believe it's a very powerful principle. First, in terms of the Bible, in terms of truth, in terms of doctrine, in terms of prophecy, in terms of just knowing what the Word of God is teaching us. The way that God has given it is often in visions, in symbols, in parables, ways difficult to understand. We wish, just like Peter probably would have wished, that God would just come out and say it explicitly. This is what's going to happen. He would give us a timeline of the world's events in very clear, concise, precise statements that in 2015 this is going to happen, then 2020 this is going to happen, 2025 Jesus is going to come, and at this day and this hour. This is what we prefer. But this is not how God has given us truth. God has given us truth. In the book of Revelation, it says that he sent his angel who signified it, or he parabolized it. It's really the word that's used there. He sent it in figures, in symbols, in images, and he expects us, as Peter, to wonder what the vision means. He expects us, like Peter, to think about the vision, to meditate on it. That's the word David uses. David says in Psalm 119, oh, how I love your law. I meditate on it day and night. It's my meditation all the day. What he's saying is, yes, God's law is there, but it's not just simple. This is what you should do. This is what you should not do. There's something deeper. And David meditated on that. Peter thinking on that. And this is what God expects from us. If we're to understand what Revelation is teaching us, if we're to understand even truth sometime about the gospel, if we're to understand why God did certain things, why God does certain things, doesn't do certain things, we need to think and not forget what Proverbs says, that we need to call out for insight. Ask the Lord for understanding. Search for it. Search for it. Diligently search in the scriptures to understand what these things are. And then the promise is there that the Lord himself gives knowledge. From his mouth come wisdom and understanding. And by those means, we will know what the truth is. The second application is, again, as we're looking at in this series here, on what is God's will for me. Where is it that God would have me to be in life? Who would God have me to be with in terms of marriage? How long would God have me to stay at a particular job? Where would God have me to be? These questions can be answered in the same way. Think on it. Wonder about it. This is a part of how God reveals it. Unfortunately, it's not the primary means, at least unfortunate from our perspective, it's not God's primary means of communicating his will to just say it. He doesn't generally. There are times when he does do this, but in general, it's not God's method to write in the sky, marry this woman, go to this job, go to this school, major in this. Most of the time, the primary way is that God gives us some revelation, some vision, something like that, some message, but then we have to wonder about it. We have to think about it. We have to ponder it, meditate on it, and match it with God's previous revelation. Knowing everything I know about who God is, knowing everything I know about who I am, knowing everything I know about this circumstance, how can I fit this to know and understand and discern the will of God? And just like Peter, we can come to this conclusion and say, God has shown me that this is who I should marry. God has shown me that this is where I should live. That God has shown me that this is the job that I should take. But again, the good news about this is that this is Peter. We shouldn't think that because we don't have some supernatural revelation from God, that we're not getting a message from the sky, we're not getting all these signs to communicate with us. We shouldn't think that because of that, we're far from God, or God doesn't speak to me. I actually remember a time in my experience where I would be asking God to speak. I want to hear your voice. I need to hear your voice. And I was really thinking that he would respond and tell me things, communicate to me directly. But looking at this, that's not how he spoke to Peter. That's not how he spoke. And I don't know many other apostles that we could say that were closer to Christ than Peter. That's not how he spoke to him. And so we shouldn't think that if he's not speaking to us that way, then that means we're far from him. Again, as we've seen in the other chapters in Acts, primarily God communicates his will to us by wisdom, by thinking, by understanding. He also does use supernatural methods and means sparingly. He does use those as well. But again, his primary way is for us to understand it by reason